MCA stage, Miranda Lash.
Good morning, everyone. It is so great to be with you today. I'm a huge fan of Creative Mornings. I used to go to them when I lived in Louisville, Kentucky, before Denver. And I actually was very excited when I was approached about the topic of ethos, because I feel like as a curator, I'm very at home with having to explain to others my beliefs, my ideals, why I do what I do. Ethos, I love its Greek for character. It's basically the rounding purpose, or the central purpose for what you practice. I'd like to advocate that centering yourself in your ethos is relevant to any profession, especially creative ones. Because let's face it, if you're a creative person, you're pretty much constantly asked to explain either what you do, why you're doing it, why you're not doing something else. And let's be real, we want to be, this is the marathon, not the sprint. We want to be creative practitioners, not just for 1 year or 2 years, but across a lifetime. And so to do that, I do believe one of the central facets is being able to be grounded in your ethos and also explain it to others, and maybe going through a regular practice of revisiting it personally. So I feel like if I were to state my ethos in one sentence, it would be to advance innovative platforms for art with the aim of expanding the discourse of what art is. And I do so if you think of my ethos as like nesting dolls, the larger reason I do that is because I firmly believe that advancing the arts and having free artistic discourse is foundational to a healthy democracy. Full stop. We cannot have a functioning democracy without advancing artistic voices. If you look across the world, the measure of any successful democracy is in part manifested by the freedom they allow their artists and how they support their artists. So this is important, not just because we love any specific artwork, but because this is part of healthy society. My ethos and why I do what I do is in so many ways informed by a desire to advance experimentation. As a curator, my ethos has to align with the institutional ethos of where I work. And at the MCA Denver, we're a contemporary art specific museum. We do not collect, so there's no collection. The whole building flips every 3 months. And the goal is to advance new commissions, new work, and really, we talk about finding inflection points in artist practice. So in other words, who's growing, who's really pushing themselves, and how can this museum be a platform for how an artist can push themselves or explore a new direction. Because we're talking about what motivates me personally, I feel like it is relevant to talk about where I come from and who I am, because it's undeniable that informs my ethos. I was raised in Los Angeles. I come from a very large, very loving Mexican family. The foundational figures in my life are 2 totally badass Mexican women, my mother and my grandmother. They came here to this country. They had to learn the language, make a new life. So I definitely have that immigrant mentality instilled in me in who I am and what I do. Even though neither of them are in the art world or deeply familiar with art, I did watch both of them infuse what they did with love. My grandmother raised 8 children. My mother is a family care, primary care physician who dedicated 40 years to serving migrant workers and Spanish-speaking immigrant populations. So I feel like because they ground their practice in love, I take that very much to how I support the art that I advance and why I do it. In part, when you're looking out at the world and deciding what to do and what to present, it's not just what is interesting, but also there's that larger ethos of what is relevant to your community and what are the most relevant discourses to surface now. So if you think, again, the nesting dolls idea, so if I have my own personal ethos of what motivates me, there's the ethos of my larger institution, and then there's the ethos of Denver. And what does Denver need? And what would be the most relevant discourse to pull forward right now in 2022 at this moment? So that's sort of a fun kind of package that I play with. The project we have on view right now at Denver is called the Dirty South. It should say Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and the Sonic Impulse. That's my bad. I was clearly not focusing when I did the slide. It's a beautiful show. It's a large-scale show. Some people have asked me, why bring a discourse about the American South to the mountains west? And I actually believe it's because it's part of this discourse of understanding American culture writ large. In other words, you can't understand American culture without understanding the South, without understanding the artists there, how they've shaped both visual art and also our own musical culture. And this is an effective project to do it. This is on view right now, and this gets into another definition of the word ethos. So there's the personal definition, in other words, what motivates you, but then there's this other definition that can be applied to a place or an environment. And this particular exhibition explores how do we approach the ethos of the South? How do we wrap our minds around the entire region? And I love this question. It's actually a question I've explored earlier in my practice. So earlier in my career, I worked for many years in New Orleans at the New Orleans Museum of Art. My husband's from there. I worked there 7 years in the post-Katrina period. And I worked with another curator who's amazing, Trevor Schoonmaker, on creating a project called Southern Accent. And we wanted to do this project because he was based at the is based at the National Museum at Duke University. I was based in New Orleans. I'm not from the South, but I found consistently when I asked people what the South was, I got 1,000 different answers. You know, the South is horrible. The South is amazing. The South has this incredibly dense, rich cultural history. The South is the cradle of some of the darkest periods of American history, most notable of which is the transatlantic slave trade and the extended damage done by both slavery and systemic racism. So how can the South be all these things at once? How do you wrap your mind around the ethos and sentiment of a place? Ultimately, we felt that the only way to do it justice was to include a lot of voices in the discussion. So Dirty South, which is curated by Valerie Cassell Oliver, an incredible curator hailing out of Houston, includes 60 artists. Southern Accent, we had about 52. And it kind of got into, you can come to that feeling or that sentiment through a sense of plurality. So all this time thinking about regional culture and what that means eventually led me to my current project that I'm working on, which is Prospect New Orleans. So I do work at MCA Denver, but I will share with you a little bit about my side hustle, which is working on an international art triennial in New Orleans. I'm happy to talk about this. It's a little awkward because I'm also going to out myself as being deeply in love with New Orleans. And I know I'm married to Denver, and I love Denver, but when I moved here, I told Denver, there's this other love in my life, it's New Orleans, and I hope that's okay, and so far, so good. As I mentioned, I practiced in New Orleans for many years as a curator. I was invited to now engage in the idea of a citywide triennial. And so this is a map that I'm sharing with you of the first iteration of Prospect. And I'm just going to share with you a little bit of an overview of what Prospect is. So it's a citywide triennial, so that means not just museums, but also unconventional spaces. So might be a bar, might be an abandoned Ford motor plant. It might be the Mississippi River itself. It might be a hotel. It might be a high school auditorium. It straddles a vast expanse of the city. Typically, it's 20 to 24 venues. It was founded in 2008 in response to Hurricane Katrina and the levee failures throughout New Orleans. So if we could wind the clock back to that period, in 2005, 80% of the city went underwater. There was widespread devastation and systemic failure of support for the city. There were many endeavors, from so many foundations and so many nonprofit organizations to assist in the revitalization of New Orleans. It was felt, and I should say, and it should be expressed, that during that precarious period, especially in the first few years after Hurricane Katrina, there were a lot of calls from across the country essentially asking New Orleans to justify its ethos. In other words, like, why do you still live here? Like, why don't you leave? That your whole damn city went underwater. So not only why are you staying, but why should the government and other institutions pay money to help this city come back. And New Orleans' response, among many other types of responses, was the cultural history of this specific place is so rich that it has to be worth preserving. And you cannot understand what America is without understanding, for example, places like Congo Square, which was the first place where Africans were allowed to have drumming circles on Sundays during times of slavery. Congo Square is the cradle of jazz, which later gave birth to blues. There are deep roots to our musical and cultural history that only exist here, and it's worth fighting for. And this was at a time when, for example, there were urban developers saying that this and that neighborhood, Broadmoor, should be completely flattened and made into green space. Why not just make the whole neighborhood a park? And actually, it was a fascinating process of watching neighborhoods partner, for example, with the Kennedy School of Government and advocate for their own survival. So anyway, the creatives in the city and people who were creative that loved the city banded together and, under the leadership of Dan Cameron, established an international art triennial, the intent of which was to bring art tourism to New Orleans, to show some of the finest exhibiting artists internationally in New Orleans, and but also to highlight Louisiana culture and provide a context for people to be exposed to it. That was Prospect 1, which opened in 2008. We're now on Prospect 6, so if you do the math, yeah, we missed a few years, COVID, et cetera. It's still international in scope, with an emphasis on the Gulf South. So in other words, about 20% of the artists are still from there. As I mentioned, it's citywide. It has a strong track record of commissioning new work and fostering experimentation. One of my personal joys as a curator is being pseudo-midwife, by the way, like where I get to work with artists on not just advancing the work they've already created, but supporting their process of creating new things that will be new to the world and debuted in contexts like these. And it has an overall operating budget of about $5 million. I share that just to give you a sense of scale. So we anticipate it'll be about 50 artists. This is a work from Prospect, the first Prospect in 2008. This is an artwork called Mithra by Mark Bradford, who is an incredible LA-based artist, and it's an ark that he created out of shipping containers that was situated in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans. And I mention this because the first Prospect was very much about that recovery period. In other words, arguing for the survival of New Orleans, bringing people face to face with the devastation. Was situated basically on a lot that used to have houses on it, had been completely flattened, and now the artwork was brought in for this biennial to sort of articulate the idea of the submerging flood that enveloped this neighborhood. Since then, New Orleans continues to evolve, as does every city, but New Orleans, we had a lot of discussion, for example, 10 years after Hurricane Katrina in 2015. It's been 10 years on, where is the city now? And actually, a lot of New Orleanians specifically talked about and requested, like, don't foreground Katrina anymore. It was horrific, but what we really want to talk about is who we are now, how our vibrance persists, how do we want to situate. New Orleans, about 5 years after Katrina, became an extremely popular place for young people to move. It was on all the top 10 lists of one of the most popular cities for college graduates to go to, so it's also rapidly gentrifying. And part of the story of how the city shifted was that, from pre-Katrina to post-Katrina, many rents doubled because of the housing shortage, and then through further gentrification, within 5 years after Katrina, the rents doubled again. So in other words, quadrupled from where they were during the pre-Katrina years. So where is the city now? Now that Solange has moved there, now that Arcade Fire has moved there, now that we have all these super hip people, I'm not against hip people, but there was these funny hashtags going around. For example, when Solange visited a local empanada place, and then it was called hashtag, empanadas with Solange, basically to highlight all the ways that the city was rapidly shifting, and people were moving there. And that was good for the economy of New Orleans, but there was also this anxiety about, like, how are we going to maintain who we are, especially if people move to the Bywater neighborhood, which is famous for music in the streets, live clubs, and then they're calling the police saying, hey, I'm trying to go to bed, it's 10 o'clock, So in what ways is the city shifting during this period? So this artwork that I'm showing you here is from the 4th iteration of Prospect, and it's an artwork by Kara Walker. It's a calliope that she designed. So Kara Walker is known for her incredibly beautiful but also incisive silhouette designs drawn from the history of the period of slavery in the American South. And so she designed a calliope because something that she noticed going around New Orleans was there's still these old school steamboats that cross the rivers, and she knows the steamboat calliopes always play these very happy songs. And she's like, well, what if I created a calliope that actually delved into the deeper musical histories of the South, acknowledged the legacies of slavery, and situated that calliope right on the river, so that it would essentially be this sonic dialogue between the steamboat calliope and her calliope, her collaborator was actually Jason Moran. I mentioned that because that was one of the first projects I brought to Denver, was a solo exhibition with Jason Moran, incredible jazz musician. I'm showing you here another example of an artwork from Prospect 3. This is a barge with a neon work by the artist Tavares Strawn. And this was, again, during that transitional period, so Prospect 3 was about 8 years post-Katrina, of that period of questioning, what is New Orleans, how is it changing? And he put out this very thoughtful work saying, you belong here. So, and it was directed at everyone who might see the signs. So in other words, some recent transplants, people who had been there a very long time, to basically envelop a sense of welcome towards anyone who might see it. And if you know New Orleans, you might recognize the silhouette of the St. Louis Cathedral in the background. New Orleans continues to evolve. During COVID, the tourism industry was hit very hard and has not fully recovered. The city's in a new place. It's now, for better or worse, no longer one of the top places for people to move, in part because of recent hurricanes. That's a constant in New Orleans. Continued struggles with infrastructure. People are like, it's so amazing. Oh, wait, I can't drink the water from my tap because the sanitation has been turned off. So, it's in a different phase. And so when you're tasked with something like an international art triennial, which is in effect a contemporary art exhibition. So you still have to explain why you're choosing, which artists you're choosing, but you have to make it bring it into relationship with the place that it is. In other words, I think it would be unethical of me to simply say, these are the artists I like best. I hope New Orleans likes it. I think the way I have to approach it is actually being incredibly sensitive to the city, its neighborhoods, which sites are we going to use? We don't use the same sites every iteration. Which neighborhoods have not been acknowledged historically? And what stories have not been told? When I was invited to present and basically audition for the role and give a presentation for New Orleans, I talked a lot about the importance of vibrance in New Orleans, which I felt like was an important lesson post-COVID, because we all had the opportunity to experience life without vibrance. We all went into lockdown. We all were basically concerned more about the immediate needs of survival, and everyone was miserable. Everyone was like, because that's not what motivates us as humans. Mere survival is not enough. That's not what gets us up in the morning. And so I think something that I took very deeply from my time living in New Orleans is that vibrance and celebration has to be a part of your life regularly and consistently, regardless of whether things are going well. So in other words, Mardi Gras happens every year, regardless of how its economy is doing, regardless of what else is going on. It's a faithful constant in the city because it's a city that prioritizes vibrance. And I said, let's talk about that and explore that. Also, they said, you have the option of bringing on a co-curator, and I thought, oh, thank God. I thought very deeply about who I wanted to engage with on this issue, and I really scrolled through a long list of names, curators I really admired, curators who are very intelligent, but then I thought, what do we need right now? How can we approach this differently? And the conclusion was, why not bring an artist into the discussion? An artist who knows the field very deeply, knows New Orleans very deeply, knows the Caribbean region very deeply, but also someone whose ethos I trust. someone whose values I feel like would honor what New Orleans is, and someone who would approach New Orleans with sensitivity. So I had a phone call with Ebony G. Patterson, who's an amazing artist, born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. We had worked several years ago together on presenting a solo show. And I talked with her about New Orleans. I knew she had spent time there. She had actually been an exhibiting artist in a previous prospect. And one of the reasons I knew she was the right person was because I was at a dinner a few years back for Prospect, and she sat down, the previous curator, and basically was like, let me tell you what you need to do to fix Prospect. And I was like, okay, that's the person I need. Someone who is not just invested in her own practice, but also how can we make this citywide presentation bigger, not necessarily bigger, but more responsive to the city. And we've had a lot of conversations about New Orleans as a city being grounded in a tourism economy. Where she grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, also grounded in a tourism economy. So what does it mean to create a sense of groundedness and connection to a place that is used to seeing people cycle through, where there are people who invest in it 24/7, but they're not always the people that are most noticed. And how do we cultivate that sense of home with an endeavor that is essentially itinerant? So in other words, the triennial, by its nature, is 4 months long. So we came up, this is an example of one of Emily's work. Another reason I thought she would absolutely get New Orleans, and it's certainly proving true, is she did a beautiful, incredible work that involved a procession through the streets of Kingston. And I think one of the essential facets of New Orleans, its ethos, if you will, is that culture lives in the streets. It's not something that just lives in the museum. It's really something that permeates the space. And I know she had done work in that capacity and would understand that, like, when we talk about activating the city, we're not just talking about within white cubes or within more established art spaces. So we landed on the idea, and we're still playing with it, of New Orleans as harbinger. And so what do I mean by harbinger? I mean a signal towards the future. And we came up with this concept for quite a number of reasons. One being that New Orleans is actually often associated with being mired in the past. So when you go visit that place, you see it as, oh, look, the French Quarter, it's so preserved, the Garden District, it looks like it did in the 19th century. It's not often considered a place for advanced ideas or the avant-garde, neither is the American South. But we actually talked about a few things that make it actually a signal or a harbinger of the world that is to come, for several reasons. Number one is deeply affected by climate change. It is a city that has had to, it's not an emergency state to think about climate change. It's a constant, because even when there's a hurricane would be an extreme example, but there's so many occasions through even just a rainstorm or a daily occurrence where people in the city are thinking very deeply about climate change, flooding, and how it affects their environment. Number two, it's a city that has a predominantly black population. It's a population that is, people of color. And we've talked a lot about the phrase global South versus global majority. So in the art world, it's become trendy in the past 10 years to talk about the global South as a way of shifting emphasis away from Europe and a Eurocentric mindset and thinking about discourse in countries like Africa, South America, South Asia, etc. And we said, that's great and that's super important, but let's also talk about the way most of the world lives and most of the world's economies and informal economies and the way, commerce and relationships are formed for most of the world, which has very little in common with the top 1% of the, American economy. So looking at New Orleans as a harbinger for how we understand the global majority, but also looking at New Orleans as a harbinger for how we might have to live in the future, which in other words is finding spots of vibrance and joy and celebration even during times of crisis. So in other words, not waiting for everything to be perfect, for finding a reason for celebration. So that's where we are at this point. This triennial will open in the fall of 2024 on November 1st, which means the preview party will be on Halloween in New Orleans. So if you want to circle that on your calendar. And I wanted to pull it forward as a way of thinking about, again, those nesting dolls of personal ethos being grounded in a larger perspective and that of a city. And also just, again, as a reminder, whatever your ethos is, on a quarterly basis at the minimum, I recommend revisiting it, even if it's just dictating to yourself why I'm doing what I'm doing. I love the art world, but it's a little judgy and a little tricky sometimes. And I do feel like it's not necessarily about who's the smartest or who's the best. It's honestly about who can just ride the storms and stay. And I think staying centered in your ethos is a key part of that. So I really thank you all for your time. And I will now turn over the mic to Dave. Thank you so much, Dave.